When we come to 2014, as I think I said earlier to you, I think this was a real turning point. We're looking for the immediate groundwork for what finally erupts into outright war and invasion by Russia itself, the invasion of Ukraine. Then 2014 was a turning point.
Hello, welcome back to Bogan Intel. Today's guest is Professor Roger Markwick from the University of Newcastle. Roger has spent his career researching and delving into European history, primarily that of Russia and Ukraine. And in a war that's been waging for many years now, it's been hard in Australia to get objective facts as to what's driving this war and what the end game potentially is. With mixed messaging coming in about desires to close a war that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives from both sides, it is almost impossible to get a bead what is driving this conflict and the underlying factors that propel it to where it is today. Roger joins the program to really break down some of the cultural and historical nuances well overlooked in the West that define this conflict in Ukraine and threaten to see it spill over into a continental war. So please stick around for this incredibly informative conversation with Professor Roger Markwick. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Markwick. It's great to have you on the program.
Well, likewise, Joel, it's very nice to be invited onto your program. So I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, let's kick it off with some chats about exactly these flashpoints in the world that you do look at. And I want to look at the Ukrainian war right now. On one side, there's talks about peace plans via Washington, but out of Europe at the moment, there's some quite fiery language about continuing the war. People like Kallas, the foreign minister of the EU, being quite aggressive towards the situation, as well as signs that militaries in Europe are actually picking up their recruitment drives, potentially even putting in volunteer forces and maybe even conscription. The Western narrative around this conflict in Ukraine just presents as a war as unprovoked aggression by an autocrat, essentially. And you've challenged that narrative. So where do you think this narrative's gone wrong?
Well, I think it's extremely simplistic. It's the kind of narrative that this is a war of the democratic nations against autocratic nations. And there are no prizes for guessing who are the Democrats and who are the autocrats. The Democrats, of course, exist primarily in the Western world, the European world, the United States, I dare say even Australia. The autocrats exist primarily in, let's say, Russia in the first instance, China. Once they all would have been labeled probably as communists and so forth at the peak of the Cold War that followed on from the hot Second World War. But such a narrative takes absolutely no or pays no respect, takes no consideration of the fact that we're talking about not just individuals, but in fact entire social systems, entire social and political systems, systems of state. And one could almost say it wouldn't matter very much whether there was, or in fact there was, a Biden in office in the United States, a Trump in office in the United States, a Putin in office in Russia. We're really talking about, in my opinion, a situation, or really a conflict engendered by essentially, I think this is really important context, that is the demise of the old Soviet order, whatever one thinks of it, state socialist, for want of a better term, that presented some kind, not only an alternative social order, but a challenging social order to the very powerful Western, and let's use the word capitalist social order, which really, if you take a very long view of history, has dominated the world in many respects for half a millennia. I go that far back. We won't, I don't think, talk about that today. But the demise of the Soviet Union, I think, and I'm not alone in thinking this, opened up possibilities, the opportunity for the West, the United States in the first instance, and in particular, to establish itself as the unchallenged hegemon. There was no longer any state order to put a brake on its military and economic, but particularly its military preponderance in the world. The West already had that advantage. And here you may, I mean, I think it is worthwhile repeating, the question of NATO comes into play here. There's a history there that, you know, we could spend a couple of programs on, but, you know, NATO arose out of essentially coming out of the demise of an alliance that saw the defeat of Nazism after the Second World War, when apparently the USSR, the Soviet Union, was in alliance with the West. But then the Cold War sets in, and a very big part of that is NATO. And NATO, okay, it was supposedly to defend Europe against the Soviet Union, which had just inflicted an almighty defeat on Hitler's military empire, but itself was shattered. And yet into play comes this military alliance. And the second phase of that really is that military alliance continued to exist after, for example, its counterpart in the East, the Warsaw Pact, backed by the former USSR, was basically dissolved. So
now there were agreements too. Gorbachev famously had that almost signed agreement that was kind of almost set in stone, but not quite set in stone, that guaranteed that NATO expansionism wouldn't happen as a part of the deal, right?
Absolutely, yes. There were more than a few sources for that. There are more than a few sources that confirm that. Yes, there's some debate, but you're right. There's no written agreement.
And that's the tough one when you're making a deal.
It was Secretary of State Baker in the first instance, but also the German leadership too. You know, was saying that there would be no, after the reunification of Germany with the fall of the wall and all that sort of thing in 1989, NATO would not move 1 inch, or maybe it was a mile, I can't quite remember, eastward. I might add that one of the reasons that it's thought that wasn't put in stone is because Gorbachev himself, then still secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, for him to make an agreement like that publicly was to really run, was extremely risky for him domestically, because the Soviet Union, and it's built into the bones of the peoples of the former Soviet Union, rather one might say built into the blood of that was shed by the people of the Soviet Union for him to make that kind of concession, particularly to the arch enemy in the war that led Russia, not just Russia, the Soviet Union, don't forget, was extremely risky for him to make that concession. And then, as we all know, that concession, despite all the warnings about what it would mean, not only within Russia, but within the US administration, more progressively minded people who were well informed said this is, such an expansion can only actually fuel fear and anger and rampant, if you like, nationalism, particularly within Russia, which post-Soviet Union, saw itself and certainly sees itself under Putin as the legitimate successor to the Soviet victory in the Second World War, and therefore an arch enemy of Nazism and so forth, and Western hegemonic aspirations. So that's, I believe, the context in which a good part of, not entirely, but it's a good part of the international context in which the scene has been set for a growing conflict and ultimately an actual outbreak of war.
And as you say, Roger, like Australians are quite, ill aware of this period of history here, especially, the fall of the Soviet Union through the 90s, where it was kind of this free sort of, it was like the Wild West in Russia, essentially, with oligarchs running around and Western-backed oligarchs, drawing up the country like a big Cuba cake in Godfather Part 2, that kind of vibe. And I suppose Putin was was someone who was seeing all this happening, and along with a nationalist cohort that wanted to, reinstitute Russia's power as a global power on the planet. This was a catalyst to bring Putin in. And we speak about those NATO, those promises about NATO, and they turned into frustrations quite quickly with Putin. There was that famous document written by Burns, the former CIA director, "Niet means niet," essentially, a warning to the American, to the Pentagon, saying that, any more, moving forward east any further is only going to cause a potential conflict. And I remember catching a hot mic moment between Barack Obama and Putin on a stage somewhere in Europe, where essentially it was just before Obama's second election. And he promised Putin there on this hot mic that it's all going to be okay. I just have to act tough for a little bit longer. And as soon as I get my second term, we're going to back off again.
My last election, yeah. And after my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and stand with me.
So this frustration has been there all the way up to 2014. And, through the color revolution and things that were happening in Georgia was it 08 during the Beijing Olympics? That the first
2008, yeah.
Yep. I remember that going down during the Beijing Olympics and going, what the hell's going on there? But I just want to take you back a little bit to that NATO expansion, because a lot of people in the West say that NATO expansion was kind of benign and it was even welcomed by Russia. But, people like John Mearsheimer, who famously, that's probably the most watched lecture in history now on YouTube, where he talks about leading Ukraine down the primrose path.
What's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked.
Yes.
Do you see that period, that 1990 to 2008 period, as like a decisive period where there was a lost opportunity for approachment, for a new paradigm between Russia and Moscow, between Moscow and Washington?
Well, that was certainly the hope. At that point, I'm talking about the 1990s, which was a terrible period in Russia. And, I mean, you were quite right. I think you talked about a Wild West or something. In fact, I was there.
Yeah, well,
Quite a couple of times conducting research and in fact, I've just been reading back a little bit about the fate of some of the intellectuals historians and so forth that I met at that time, quite senior figures and so forth. Russia were, not just Russia, almost all of those states, Russia, Ukraine, particularly, they were on their knees. And basically the state, by which I mean the old Soviet state, was actually being robbed under this, in the guise of in the guise of democracy under Yeltsin, who went on to turn the tanks against his own parliament. Let me get that date right. 1993, I'm pretty sure. This was seen as an opportunity, but but what was the opportunity? No real liberalism came about. No, one might say, chance for democracy, let alone the chance for this new democratic opening, the end of history, as it was famously, perhaps infamously called, the death of communism. There was no other future but essentially neoliberal capitalism. Even if that term wasn't used, the terms were essentially and remain in many respects democracy. So words like capitalism are extremely rarely used even now. So, I mean, Yeltsin proved himself to be not only a drunkard and so forth, but incapable of dealing with the West, primarily because, in this case, Russia did not have the capacity to assert itself, and this was most vivid when NATO, in 1998, I hope I'm getting the chronology right here. It's always a bit tricky on the run, but without actually getting any sanction from the United Nations, proceeded to bomb Serbia, which was then still part of Yugoslavia, bombed it for about 63 days, day and night. Ostensibly to end a war, but really to finally to break up what was left of the old Yugoslavia. And that was a big political blow to Russia, because Serbia and Russia had historically been very strong allies for, amongst other reasons, their shared orthodoxy and so forth. I'm talking about Orthodox religion. But
and Roger, I think it's just important to interrupt here. Like, that was an operation. Was it Operation Allied Freedom? Was that the name of the bombing campaign there in '99? I forget what it was. Allied Freedom or something like that. But essentially that bombing from the West. It's taken a long time to deconstruct what happened there. And if it was about checking Russian power within the Eastern Bloc there and breaking up its greatest ally. But I do want to point towards some things, some criticisms towards Russia here, I mean, in their grasp for their regional dominance and regional hegemony, or aspiring regional hegemony, but they have been involved in some pretty nasty kind of operations. Now, I'd cop a bit of flack if I was talking about this issue, potentially about maybe Grozny, for example, or the support that was provided to the Serbian, to Milosevic, and then also the conduct of Russia within the SMO itself and the way they're operating on the ground. I mean, let's not forget what other wars the West are supporting right now. But, can you lay a bit of criticism towards the modern Republic of Russia and the way it's done its adventures abroad, as far as its, geopolitical conquest?
I have no illusions, and neither should anybody else have illusions in the nature of the Russian state. Yeltsin, in the first instance, unsuccessfully ultimately, in the late 1990s, conducted a war against the Chechens who were seeking independence. And don't forget that independence had the quest for national independence had basically pulled the old Soviet Union apart. And here were peoples primarily of Muslim persuasion asserting their quest for independence. In many respects, under Stalin, for example, national independence was really, it was a fiction. Leave that aside for the moment. But Yeltsin conducted a ferocious war, but ultimately really unsuccessful war, which involved the near obliteration of Grozny. So a harsh military and militarism is built into, I'd say, the historical roots and the historical legacy of the Russian/Soviet state. Now, you can refine that, but I think that's almost a given. Along comes Putin and becomes Yeltsin's chosen successor. Putin might have been a minor KGB apparatchik, but this was the heart of the domestic Soviet state. And when he came to office, he was determined there would be no Chechnya there'd be no opportunity for it to raise its head in terms of an independent state. So he actually oversaw a campaign that was as brutal, if not much more so, than Yeltsin's war on the Chechens. And in his first year in office, unleashed a war and infamously said something like, we will bomb these terrorists, it's a common term, bomb them, wipe them out in the shithouse or the outhouse, so to speak, so.
And is there truth to those apartment bombings that happened that were
Yes.
attested to Putin as well? Was there any truth to that?
Well, that became the pretext,
Yeah,
I think.
that was the
And-
catalyst. That was the 9/11 or whatever for them to go in.
yeah, one might say that. So, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's no point, an analysis of this war cannot ignore those elements too. It's one thing to look at the nature of the Western states, and I think Mearsheimer has done a very good job about exposing the sort of drive, the NATO drive. But one also, the Russian state in particular, it's not a passive it's not a passive object. It's an agent in its own right. And don't forget that in the first instance, when Putin came to power, okay, he consolidates his domestic authority by crushing the Chechens with utmost force. And again, I was there shortly after the killing of Chechen militants in a theater there. So there's the use of force against domestic recalcitrants, if I can put it that way, is not something that Soviet/Russian authorities have been shy about pursuing. One could also extend that to Ukrainians as well, Ukrainian administrations, I mean. But Putin himself, initially when he came to power, was, surprisingly perhaps, like Gorbachev, and maybe Yeltsin also, but Yeltsin was rather more ineffective, making overtures in the early 2000s towards the West in terms of, we'd like to be part of Europe. We'd even, he said, and I'm thinking of early 2000s, at least before 2008, probably 2004, something like, the possibility, he admitted that in more recent times, of joining NATO. Now,
And hasn't the history of modern Europe really revolved in a large part around this question and around European powers wanting to deny Russia that European identity that they've been so longing for hundreds and hundreds of years now, right?
oh yeah, that's a good observation.
I mean,
Yeah,
I heard that Peter.
it's-
I heard, was it Peter that went and did some time in the UK, in England, and he was in a rowing club there with some British private school boys. I think he did some schooling, or one of the
You're talking
monarchs.
about Peter the Great.
Was it Peter the Great? It was one of the monarchs, one of the Romanov monarchs.
Well, you may be right about, I don't know about the rowing club. He went off to, as far as I know, and I haven't looked at it in detail, but I think he went to the Netherlands, perhaps Amsterdam, and he was actually impressed by their naval technology and so forth at a time when the Netherlands was quite a powerful naval body. So yes, there's always been, okay, so Russia essentially, I mean, I guess I'm simplifying to a certain degree, but particularly, let's say in the 19th century, the famous division developed particularly amongst the Russian intelligentsia. But this notion of Russophobia, so to speak, that particularly Lavrov refers to quite frequently. But just back to that original point about there have been strong currents, particularly amongst the Russian intelligentsia, or intelligentsia, as they like to say, looking, we are really a Western country. And then the so-called Slavophile intelligentsia, which look to the traditional values of the Russian countryside and so forth, Christian values, Orthodox values. These are the things that differentiate Russia from an arrogant, overweening West and so forth.
If you like this kind of thing, there's not much of it out there, to be honest. It's really important that you like, subscribe, and leave a comment wherever you can on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the show. I was speaking to Dorian Jeff Rich, who's got a great Substack and a good YouTube channel. And essentially, he was talking about the world island theory and how it was applied by the West to essentially conquering Eurasia. And I just want to pivot to this a little bit because Eurasianism is such a big part of Russia. And Russian culture and the way the political apparatus is put together, right? And I would just wanted to know a little bit about how Eurasianism is defining Russia's geopolitical objectives and ambitions as a state in the region.
Well, I think this notion of Eurasianism, which has never really gone away, wasn't really embraced by Putin. So we're leaping forward now another century, but I guess more immediately to present day circumstances. It was increasingly embraced by Putin, partly after the rebuff that he received, or Russia received, from the West. You're not going to be part of NATO. We don't welcome you into the European community. But also, and one should bear this in mind, because the Russian state and the Russian elite, political and commercial, industrial, what little there is of it nowadays, although it's powerful domestically, but not as powerful as the state, I'd suggest. The fact that in 2012 in particular, there was a lot of protest about the way Putin came back as president, having, swapped suitcases, so to speak, with
Medvedev.
Yeah. That's right. There was that agreement and so forth. So Eurasianism, under the influence of long-standing theoreticians of the notion of a Eurasian civilization, it's not Western, so it draws on that kind of Slavophile impulse. And it becomes, I think, it starts to fill a vacuum, because the Soviet Union at least had a doctrine and ideology that it acted upon in many respects, you know, official Marxism and Leninism and Sovietism and so forth, socialism. Whereas once the Soviet Union fell apart, then it like any state, it needed to fill that void. It needed legitimacy. Every state, I guess this is one of my starting points for my thinking about the way states try to justify themselves. Nation states I'm thinking about. And so establishing a kind of Eurasian sensibility, a sense that Russia was a citadel of Eurasian, but particularly European, but nevertheless increasingly Asian. So embracing a civilization that could be counterposed to the West's rather more flamboyant, rather more publicized notion of the importance of liberalism and humanism and democracy and so forth. And perhaps, and should I, if I even dare say so, say fluid gender identity and so forth. Whereas Eurasianism was built in particular, coming out of Moscow, on the notion of the importance of Russian Orthodox values, for example, being the bedrock of civilizational foundations, as opposed to the seemingly corrupt, superficial, morally bankrupt, if you like, Western liberalism and so forth.
Which was offered as the only other option, which, you know, there was this third way for the Eurasian mindset to delve into. Now, I want to sort of ask you a little bit about this, because this is a very interesting theory, and it's interesting that you say there was that vacuum, and one would say that potentially imperialism was something that could fill the vacuum, or sort of going back to the great memory of the you know, the Roman dynasties, so the Romanov dynasties that came before. But Eurasianism is fixated more on Russian culture, cultural values, and Orthodox religion, things like that. But is it a gateway drug for essentially a new imperial Russia?
Well, it certainly harkens back to that. I mean, you only have to see images of Putin coming into the Great Hall in the Kremlin and so forth. Not being there.
No one does it. No one does it like him, though. Yeah, he has a very good way.
Yes. So, you know, once the Soviet Union collapsed, they took on a lot of the iconography of the old Tsarist autocracy. You know, I mean,
what I'm trying to get to here is, you know how like China can sort of look, it has a translucent line through its recent communist history, and it can almost see it as a block of empire, you know, with its own mandate of heaven, for example. So, you know, Chinese can sort of put that continuity back into their history. And I'm wondering if, you know, I mean, we've seen Putin and his regime essentially pay lip service to these great communist heroes, to the great wars against Nazism, to things like that. But then also, as you say, hearken to that kind of imperial majesty as well. So like, are they slapping something together here in this vacuum? You know, is it a bit of a hodgepodge? And I also want to ask you too, you know, someone I've come across, and it's almost scary to say his name on the internet, but Alexander Dugin, who's, you know, considered a very controversial philosopher, and is called, you know, Putin's, you know, worm tongue and things like that. You know, he's the guy that is behind Putin, the Rasputin of modern Russia. But from all accounts, he seems to be a pretty interesting philosopher type that's traveled around Europe and contested his ideas around. So yeah, for starters, can you sort of ask what they're trying to replace the vacuum in Russia, and also give us a little bit of a background about Dugin?
Well, I don't think he plays a role, I'm going to say, on a day-to-day basis. His ideas, I think, are a hodgepodge of Eurasian civilizational claims. He's written a couple of books, the name of which escaped me, but sorry.
One of them is called The Fourth Political Theory, which you can't get on Amazon. You can get white nationalist books out of Mississippi, but you can't get The Fourth Political Theory by Alexander Dugin. It's an interesting one. But anyway, continue.
Well, I'm not sure you'd necessarily want to read it if you did get it. But, you know, I mean, these people, I found this quite interesting, actually. You know, there's sometimes talk about, Putin wants to reestablish the old Soviet Union and so forth. Well, he might have picked up on the Soviet victory on the Second World War, defeat of Nazism and so forth, and claimed that as his own. But a lot of the thinkers that, including Dugin himself, that preceded Dugin, these people come from the 1920s, 1930s. They were actually anti-Bolshevik thinkers who recognized when Stalin basically begins to assert that the Soviet Union is a great power, rather than an instrument for proselytizing or spreading, say, socialism or Bolshevism or whatever. Those sorts of figures, and I have in mind a particular figure, Ivan Ilyin, is a precursor to Dugin, and he was not alone. These were figures who, in the civil war that followed the Bolshevik Revolution, had opposed the Bolsheviks, but then in the 1930s see, okay, here's a state we're going to have to we can not only live with, but it's actually embodying the strengths of Russia, Eurasia, if not orthodoxy at that time. So Dugin has been basically positioned himself as an important articulator of the virtues of Eurasian civilization, and Russia at the center of it, which find their reflection, that's probably as far as I'm prepared to go, in the outlook of Putin himself. And one of the concepts, by the way, that is important and that's been reflected in some of Putin's speeches, presentations before the outbreak of actual war in 2022, was this concept of Novorossiya. That is a Russia based on the old empire prior to the revolution, an empire in which it was essentially entailed primarily the Russian-speaking peoples of, for example, not just Russia proper as we know it, today at least, but also regions of, and this is really important, of course, Russian-speaking regions, primarily Russian-speaking regions of what's now Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and so forth. So there's no doubt in my mind that in that sense...
Russia technically goes all the way to Odessa though, doesn't it?
Well, yes, it could even go further to Transnistria, but yes, to Odessa itself. But at the moment, now, post-war, well, and in the context of these so-called peace plan, that Trump has put forward, 28 points at last count, but I think it's just gone down a bit, you know, that's Trump's modus operandi, one might say. You know, Russia has declared quite categorically that it wants to have the Donbass, primarily Luhansk and/or Donetsk, and
Zaporozhia as well,
and also Kherson, I think it is. So, these are almost non-negotiable for Russia. And my point here is that I think this is the prism through which Putin sees the world, but hasn't always, I think we need to bear this in mind, hasn't always acted upon this.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because I mean, there is that famous friendship or bromance between Gerhard Schroeder and Putin, the former chancellor of Germany. And, around that period, it seemed like Europe and Russia were having their own kind of way with each other, aside from the potential US designs in the region. And, there was, even with the French, with the Greeks, with, many nations in Europe, profiting of each other, the cheap resources of Russia were helping to power the manufacturing bases of Germany and the developing manufacturing bases in places like Poland, for example, right? So there was this dream, and I think, yeah, potentially, the vacuum you mentioned, or the Eurasianism that kind of aped in at a certain point. That was probably the moment when it all kind of went down, right? Like when those relationships were severed, and we have to get to Maidan in order to potentially go through this period. So I was wondering if should we be starting there, or should we go back to 03?
You're talking about 2004, I think, the Orange
Revolution.
Revolution.
04, the Orange Revolution.
Yeah, which saw the overthrow of, I think it was Yanukovych for the first time. Yeah, he was ousted. There was protests and so forth. Yanukovych lost twice. Once in 2004 in the wake of these, what's referred to as the Orange Revolution.
Yushchenko came in.
Back, and he's elected, and he becomes, and he's ousted once again in the wake of the Maidan events, the Revolution of Dignity, it's sometimes called. There's no doubt in my mind that the Russian elite under Putin have always been nervous about any popular discontent, not only domestically, but also within their immediate periphery. The idea of a government being ousted by popular discontent in neighboring Ukraine, much later on in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and so forth, where you see Russia lending a hand to stabilize the situation. So what I'm trying to get at here is, the Russian state has its own interests, even if it's not necessarily direct aggrandizement, seizure of other territories or whatever, but it likes as most states do, but particularly these post-Soviet states, and they're quite fragile in my opinion, they like domestic stability. So that's something to be borne in mind. It's not an inconsiderable consideration in terms of the way the Russian state, in this case, reacts to events, certainly on its, what they call sometimes its near abroad or its immediate borders and so forth. It's got that interest in keeping both its periphery stable, but also its domestic population. It cannot afford and will not tolerate any kind of challenge to its authority. When we come to 2014, as I think I said earlier to you, I think this was a real turning point. We're looking for the immediate groundwork for what finally erupts into outright war and invasion by Russia itself, invasion of Ukraine. Then 2014 was a turning point, because there was Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych had been elected president. He was a vacillating president, so to speak, vacillating between Europe and Russia, but leaned towards Russia, let's call it something like that. And protests broke out against him. in the Maidan in the latter part of 2013.
Which Victoria Newland was famously there handing out bread. Who was Under Secretary of State or something at the time, right?
She was Assistant Secretary of
Sorry?
State. That comes a little bit later to my knowledge. In early 2014, when
Sorry.
things have changed, and yep, I was there pretty much. Actually, I was not in Moscow, but I was in Russia at the time, reading about the way in which things were developing in the Maidan. And you've used the word coup. I must confess, I've been, maybe it's a fear of being accused of conspiracies, but the more closely one looks at the violence of events in February 2014, the more you see footage and or reads transcripts of conversations between people like Victoria Nuland, who's there on the square, more than handing out bread and so forth. I think Senator John
McCain. Yep, he was there too.
Thank you. He was there then too.
As were some Georgian snipers in a building across from Maidan, right?
Oh, yes,
that opened fire into the crowd.
So there's a lot of questions asked about how did these peaceful demonstrations in the latter part of 2013 turn into such violent events that the end result was the ousting, with the blessing, really, underhand blessing, but blessing of the United States and the acquiescence of important EU powers like France, like Germany, in the ousting of a president whose tenure had actually been a compromise had been reached to allow Yanukovych to remain president, at least for an interim period, and that would, there would be a political settlement to the conflict. But it's pretty clear, in fact, it's very clear that the US was keen to have a pro-Western, and Western's not close enough, a pro-US president in Kiev. And so out with Yanukovych.
In with Poroshenko.
By the name of Poroshenko.
Yeah.
Otherwise known as the Chocolate King, one of these oligarchs who made his money from, well, amongst other things, chocolate, apparently.
And it was the Poroshenko era of Ukraine, which is the era that the West, or the majority of the West, has become romanticized with, right? That it's that 2014 afterward period in Ukraine that the West has kind of latched onto, right? And that, like, there was no history before 2014, in the way we say there's nothing happened before October 7. In some ways, to the West, nothing happened before 2014 as well, right?
Well, I don't know whether it's so much sort of lionized by the West with incoming of Poroshenko. I mean, it's almost like that period doesn't exist because along comes Zelensky. But yes, that period saw the resurgence of an increasingly well-established and very violent ultra-right. And it's that ultra-right, the infamous Azov Brigade, Right Sector, Pravy Sector, and so forth.
The Banderites, as they're called.
These military detachments that drew their inspiration from what are referred to disparagingly in Russia as Banderites, the Ukrainian insurgent army during this, pro-Nazi organizations and so forth. That's the period in which what I would call, I suppose in more academic terms, when the extreme right wing, but ethno-nationalism, the desire for a purely Ukrainian state, purged more or less of its Russian component, or rather Russian speaking, Russian identification, Russian Orthodox inclined populace, particularly concentrated in the eastern band, so to speak, the eastern regions, the Donbass in particular, those old industrial regions. That became anathema really to the Poroshenko regime. That was anathema to these extreme, let's just call them ethno-nationalists, but it did feed into, and does still feed into, extreme right-wing armed groups who openly hail Nazism in a way that you cannot do, for example, in Russia. That's not to let Russia off the hook.
That's right. And but look, I think this is fascinating, and as we said, many people don't really know much about this stuff. And looking back at, going back a bit further, even, after World War II, there were there was CIA involvement in the 50s in that western part of Ukraine. Stirring up sowing the seeds of this early nationalism, and this Stefan Bandera culture was kind of was incubated in this region, in this time, right? And it was quite weird to see people like Victoria Nuland, whose lineage comes from Ukraine, and Anthony Blinken, who have, many of these US decision makers, have family from Ukraine that were directly linked by one or two generations removed. And it was quite, it was like watching a play being sort of played out here, right? Because by the time we got to, are you in a rush?
No.
Oh, great. But by the time we got to, the bread in the street kind of period, that nationalism had been well and truly stoked. So much so that when the overthrow happened, there was an event that really caught my eye, which juxtaposes so much with just the flat out subjectivity of the Western coverage of all of this. But I caught, wind of that massacre in the Odessa Trade Union building in 2014. So this was one of the first acts of reprisal after that turn, where essentially they were football hooligans turned ultra right-wing nationalists, came down south and started attacking people in Odessa for being, Russian speaking or linked to Russians. And there's a famous scene of 60 or 70 unionists of all ages stuck in a building that's being torched. And this ends up leading into what was called, essentially an anti-terrorist operation in the Donbass, where Ukrainian forces went into the Donbass, and, UN reported over 14,000 people died in a period there. So I was just wondering if you can give us a bit more information about that.
Sure. Yes, that is a very little known event. But before I get to that, I think just again, I guess context is important here. I mean, you're right. The CIA was sort of stoking remnants of ethno-nationalism, fascism, if you like, that still existed after the Second World War. There were ongoing wars, by the way, with internal, with Soviet troops that went on almost, I think, until the Khrushchev period and so forth. But I don't want to dwell on that. Yeah. But what really facilitates this resurgence of ultra-nationalist and fascist, let's not beat around the bush here, is that in fact the elites, the post-Soviet elites really, I talked about a vacuum of ideology. They really pumped up nationalism. So just as Russia has come to embrace its own nationhood, nationalism and so forth, in lieu of even some kind of, let's call it Soviet style statism and so forth, the notion of representing Ukraine as a nation and the patriotic sense of that rather, replaced the whatever notions of, say, socialism in Ukraine or Russia or Kazakhstan or wherever else. So that provides a kind of context that can allow these underground forces in a state of when the society itself, and Ukraine itself was very impoverished. These societies, and particularly Ukraine, was looking, and still does, I think. People were poor. The institutions had been ripped away. Corruption was rife. Violence amongst various oligarchs and so forth. All of that provided grist to the mill of retrieving this ideologies that one would think had been actually extirpated by the defeat of Nazism by the Red Army primarily by the end of the Second World War. So it's in that context when these people come to the fore, and by that I have in mind these armed detachments that involve death, killing, snipers, and so forth on the Maidan in March of 2014, February, March anyway, 2014. Then that incident that you mentioned, the people of the Russian speakers were aghast, actually. Frankly, they were fearful that the Western Ukraine would turn the Kiev, essentially, with its sort of Catholic background and that sort of thing, they're Western-oriented and deeply, increasingly Ukrainian nationalist movement would turn against them. And that's when you get the emergence of, in a serious way, of these detachments of militias in the Donbass to resist the prospect, a real prospect, of an onslaught against them.
And this was in response to a military build-up by the Ukrainian army in that region,
absolutely.
Right?
And as part and parcel of that, just to quickly touch back on that horrific events in Odessa, which gives you an idea of the ferocity of the social conflict that was being unleashed. You're quite right. There were Russian speakers who were demonstrating, and more than that, as far as I know, they had fought the police and so forth. But then the tables were certainly turned upon them when they sought retreat in the trade union building. I can't say whether they're all trade unionists, but that's where they went. And those ultra nationalist stroke fascist forces outside burnt the building to the ground, and people were leaping from the windows, often as not to their death, and the police simply stood by and let it happen. So in many respects, one might say it was a kind of a replica of, not entirely, I guess, but it's certainly a lethal echo of what had happened in the Maidan, and it was a warning, an opening salvo of what would come to the Donbass.
That's right. And it would have sent such a shudder through the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, and also through to Moscow, where they would have been wondering, what this kind of group, who really had just been had been a bunch of football hooligans getting kicked out of football games before this moment, were going to do. And they ended up burning people alive in buildings, and the government ended up, looking to massacre people in the Donbass, I suppose, as some kind of reprisal against Russian speakers. There's something I want to point out here that really perplexes me about the region. I have a friend from Sumy Oblast who's living as a refugee in Europe at the moment. And one thing that always sort of sticks out is just how much Russians and Ukrainians are united by language, by culture, by, listening to the same music and following the same comedians. Zelensky being one of them, right? Zelensky was a comedian who was known more in Russia as a Russian speaker who hardly knew Ukraine and owed a lot of his career to performing in Russia. And there was this kind of cross-cultural exchange that was just inherent in the country. And it seems to juxtapose so much with this kind of, Ukrainian nationalism that asks for a different language, that has a whole different cultural set attached to this kind of more of a Northern European kind of sensibility or something like that. And, you compare it with other conflicts in the world where there's, stark differences in, tribal differences or language differences and things like that. And, it seems like a hard one to sell, Russians killing Russians or, Ukrainians killing Russians, but, having Slavs killing Slavs, essentially. Yeah, was there like a fervor that was rolling through the main in Ukraine? Because I couldn't imagine the majority of the population wanted this kind of violence. And wasn't Zelensky's election essentially as a unifying candidate? People that had a gut full of the period beforehand, and Zelensky promised to come in and unify. I can't forget that footage of him going down to the Donbass after his election. And, he's in a flak jacket and he's waving his hands down at the, paramilitaries down at the border. I don't know if you've seen this. And he's like, he's like, you've got to stop this.
О том, что демилитаризация украинских кордонов, мы бы хотели это все обсудить и формализировать, чтобы потом не было как у Петра Алексеевича.
Ты со мной хочешь формализировать отношения?
В меморандуме.
Я с тобой?
Не я с вами, а все люди, которые в этом процессе, те, которым болит за Украину.
Капитуляция, прошу так.
Формализация.
Я пришел тебе сказал, вы оружие выведете, а ты меня переводишь стрелки.
Так я вам второй момент уже озвучил. Я вас услышал, вы сказали.
Ты мне вообще не можешь никакой ультиматум озвучивать, Денис, ты не понял.
Так я вам ультиматум, я говорю, это были люди.
Нам за эти оружие забрать?
При чем здесь? Я вам говорю за второй момент.
Right now, and this bloke just leans over and pretty much says, I'm going to kick the shit out of you if you don't get out of my face right now. Get out of here. You know what I mean? He pretty much just says that. We are not stopping this. So, I mean, what happened there? Because all of a sudden Zelensky became this like warmonger, Churchill 2.0 champion of Ukraine. So was this like a complete, like a remake, like a makeup job on someone? Or was this Zelensky's intentions all the way to be a conduit for Western aggression against Russia?
That's a difficult one to answer. Just before I respond more especially to Zelensky, what you say is right about the question of Slavs fighting Slavs or Ukrainians fighting Russians and so forth. I was in. Well, long ago, too long ago it's almost embarrassing, but I went to Kharkiv, as it was called in Russian, in Kharkiv, as it's called now, where people, I did a crash Russian speaking course there. So, there was a very close connection. That's another aspect of this demise of the Soviet Union as contextual. The suddenly competing nationalisms emerging where they haven't, and cultivated by elites where they hadn't existed before. And even families. A lot of these people were intermarried. I can recall that certainly well before all of this. People saying, well, I can't go to Ukraine now where my mother-in-law or mother lives because, or vice versa, because now I've got to have a passport and a visa and so forth.
Khrushchev was right. Khrushchev was Ukrainian too, right?
Yeah. Yes, I think you're correct about that. But as for Zelensky, it's difficult to know. I can't give a definitive answer as to why he switched gear, soon after he was elected. You're absolutely right. He came to office, he trounced Poroshenko in the elections, and he did so on a kind of peace platform. He wanted to have a rapprochement with Russia. This was before the war. There were tensions. He did want to revisit the Minsk Accords, which had allowed for a certain autonomy for the Donbass regions and district regions, I should say. And so, you know, it was the promise of stability that he represented. Now, I can only suspect that there were powerful forces within the Ukrainian elite who had already built links with particularly the Western elites who wanted Ukraine to be part of Europe, part of, and ultimately part of NATO, allied with the West, and they, I suspect, but I can't provide evidence, chapter and verse evidence for this. Perhaps there are other, I'm sure there are other scholars who can, but
good. We'll look it up.
Turned him towards a pro-NATO stance, an anti-Russian stance. I mean, don't forget, and this is not an unimportant and extraordinary thing, that built into the Ukrainian constitution was the determination to become part of NATO. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary phenomenon, and Zelensky, servant of the people, so to speak, the famous actor, coming from backstage, one might say, to the very front stage, turns politically. He'd never been a major political figure, politician. Suddenly he's president with powerful figures around him. And those promises of peace, of some kind of understanding with Russia, of an understanding with the Russian-speaking peoples of the Donbass and the associated regions, all of that was being swept away and raising the temperature.
And those influence
watch,
yep.
On his watch.
Yep.
And
those pressures also coming via, through Washington as well, right? So he had his internal pressures, but then he also had these pressures from Washington that had obviously been sold a new model of warfare via these hidden powers in Ukraine, which was this, what's become now as the Ukrainian model of proxy warfare, where they offered millions of blood of lives, the blood and treasure of Ukraine, and they opened the keys up to the Americans to essentially have a crack at Russia with little consequences, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I don't think, if you judge by the outlook of figures who always springs to my mind, Victoria Nyland, who seems to have been everywhere, she and her...
She's in Africa at the moment, by the way.
Where is she?
She's in Africa at the moment, doing a fair bit of work in and around Africa. So, yeah, it's just incredible.
Well, good for her. I've no doubt that the West, the United States in particular, was keen to... they weren't going to let go of the promise that they had an opportunity to reduce Russia to a regional power, so that it would be subordinated, and they, meaning Washington in particular, and this is certainly the way Moscow increasingly saw it, reduce, essentially Moscow to a subordinate power, and it would be the US that would exercise its dominion over Eurasia itself, if need be, because they saw it as the kind of heartland.
On the ground, the analysts like yourself, in that McGregor, that Ritter, Mearsheimer, Sachs realm, people that have actually had experiences in these areas and lived and worked in these areas, you're describing like a slow grind, essentially, where Russia's winning at their game of warfare. You know, these artillery tube style wars that are very slow and slowly eking incremental gains over this very flat landmass that they've become very comfortable with fighting on. But leaders in the West, like Callas and, you know, old Stoltenberg, which are just some of the things coming out of his mouth were mind blowing, and von der Leyen, they keep insisting that Ukraine's winning. Who was it the other day that said Ukraine's still winning, but the battle's not going the direction we wanted, or something like that? You know, just these ridiculous lines. What psychological and political function do these like competing narratives serve, you know, ultimately for the end game in this war, for the reality of it?
As far as Western Europe's concerned, they have picked up the mantle that Trump has, I was going to say adroitly, but he doesn't do many things adroitly, does he? Dropped. That is, he's passed the responsibility for paying for the continuation of a war that he can distance the United States from. Not all of his MAGA base, so to speak, like the idea of the United States squandering billions on warfare. So he likes to style himself, as we all know, or as the peacemaking president, which is rather bizarre. But the United States has not only been, I think, focusing its efforts on Russia with with an eye to what might happen in relation to China, but it's also used this war and NATO to bring Europe to heel, to make sure that it's subordinate to US interests, forcing it to pay its own way in terms of military hardware, acquired, by the way, often as not from major US military corporations, and to remilitarize at the expense of their own, as these things often go, at the expense of the needs of the domestic population. Now, Russia, everybody thought, and I must admit, I was surprised, but anyway, but I don't think I'm alone, you know, has proven to be infinitely more resilient in terms of its capacity to face down extraordinary sanctions in particular, and maintain a war over a prolonged period. But it's another thing for Europe, which, having been through two wars, particularly Germany, and come out not the winners, the appetite for war, I'd suggest, and one would have to find the data to demonstrate this, but I don't think particularly among the younger generation of, say, Europeans, the idea of getting ready for war, of being conscripted as they want to do now in Germany, and as a friend of mine has told me, a German friend, said, you know, this idea of once again going to war against Russia, we have to defeat it. Well, the United States has passed that responsibility to Europe. Trump is able to step back a bit. That's somewhat attractive, I'd suggest, to Moscow, to Putin, the idea that, okay, this will take the pressure off us. We might even be invited into the US orbit rather than being subordinated to it. And at the same time, if I can add, you know, Germany in particular, the economic powerhouse of Europe, reduced to buying gas from Russia, its industrial sectors, which were renowned, being drained,
And
well,
the Nord Stream 2, which we haven't mentioned, comes into play here. I mean, this was the handshake. This was the tacit arrangement between Russia and Europe in action right there. That for all the differences, it was beneficial to both parties to have this relationship in place. And it still is to some extent, because Europe is still buying Russian gas, long story short, and Russian oil, as well as India, as well as the US, ultimately through India. So I would like to sort of, I'd like to ask a little bit about that too. How does Nord Stream come into play here with what you were just saying?
Well, there are all sorts of theories, conspiracy theories, if you like, about who blew it up, from the Russians themselves to the Ukrainians. That's the latest one, I think. Did the US have a role in it? Did the Danish Secret Service? Lots of figures. A couple of people being charged, and so forth, particularly in recent times, I think Ukrainians. But back to my point about the way in which the United States has really managed, I think, to subordinate Europe more than ever to its own designs, is that I can remember Biden saying to the Social Democratic leader of Germany at the time on television something like, yes, all this Nord Stream 2, my words, we can do something about that, the United States. I think even a reporter later asked him, how would you do that? And he just said, we have the means. But the German chancellor just sat there and said nothing. So a chief ally of the United States, really humiliated in the public arena, in the public domain. I think that points to the United States making itself a winner, in the sense of, leaving aside all the other stuff that Trump's done in recent times, making itself a winner in the sense of pursuing proxy wars, letting other people do the dying and maybe now the funding for them, but still pursuing its own aims, but perhaps under Trump, in this scenario, in this domain, I'm talking about Ukraine, Russia, able to distance itself somewhat from the process and put Europe, which is actively putting itself in the firing line now, actively. People like Kallas and von der Leyen and so forth pursuing this.
Totally. It's such a stroke with the brush you've got to make here to really give this the credit it's due. And then we need to unpack this part of history. We need to unpack these developments in order just to get to the gooey center of what's going on here. And now we have a battleground that's, as we said, in a stalemate. Both parties talking differing messages. There's been many red lines that Putin has drawn on the map that have been broken. Now we have early warning radar systems being attacked deep in the Russian interior. You have, was it the Kursk incursion where, there was a whole bunch of Ukrainians that went across the border. And I think it took many months to sort of finish that conflict. And, then you've got the Britain and the European powers that you mentioned, more so, granting weapons that are, long range weapons, cruise missiles and things like that. And it just seems like there's no calm heads in the room at the moment anywhere. You mentioned Germany sort of cuckolding itself, essentially, like watching its industrial base, evaporate before their very eyes, only to kind of appease Washington and their intentions in the region. It's quite a warning for Australia, for Japan, for the Philippines, for Taiwan, and because this Ukraine model is the one that's going to, you think it's going to be tried probably first as an option. And, to see who's up for it. And essentially Australia hasn't said that we're not up for that either. Germany didn't interject and say, hey, you can't blow up our Nord Stream. could there be a potential that the US now, in order to get regions or countries to become favorable to their war intentions, that they could actually be sabotaging their allies or their vassal states in order to get them into that position to do that?
Well, I'd hesitate to say that, certainly in relation to Australia. I'd put it the other way. Australia, unfortunately, in my opinion, is actively seeking
That's right.
to support the United States.
Because it wants to avoid that scenario, right? Like, Albo's just terrified of being cooed like Whitlam. We've seen no one's laid eyes on Imran Khan for about a month now. There's rumors that he's just been killed in prison. This could be the situation, right? Yeah, you're right. Like now after Ukraine, potentially everyone else is just going to go, yeah, we'll come. Just don't blow up our infrastructure.
Again, I would hesitate to extend that scenario at least to Australia. I mean, Australia and the Albanese government in particular, almost from day one, was contributing as actively as it could with our, I suppose, limited capacity and extraordinary distance from the situation in Ukraine, actively contributing weaponry, however small, but it's symbolic, sending dated tanks, sending bushmasters and all sorts of other things, being a kind of honorary associate, if you like, member of NATO. And then, of course, there's AUKUS. Quite deliberate integration, increasing integration of Australia into the US security state. So I don't see much, in fact, I don't see any coercion. I don't think that people like Prime Minister Albanese, Richard Marles, Defence Minister, particularly, I guess he would be, and Senator Penny Wong, they're as keen as mustard for us to be part of this US alliance. It's closer than ever, more secretive than ever, more expensive than ever.
And there's no daylight. There is actually no daylight.
Out of fear.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Yeah.
I think they're actually convinced that that is the way forward for Australia. And I think should be obvious. I think that's a major error that needs to be challenged.
We've spoken about these true believers, with a few guests now, and that there is a real true believer kind of thing going through Canberra at the moment. And, that they say that there's no daylight between Washington and Canberra on many issues. And as Trump's about to invade Venezuela and the Monroe 2.0 is about to kick off, along with God knows how many more regional wars that start in the next couple of years of Trump, it's not very heartening to think that that's the case, that there is no struggle, that there are no difficult conversations between Canberra and Washington, where there are in Europe, where there are in the core Asian allies. There's a lot of argy-bargy going on in Japan, in Korea, and even in the Philippines about sovereignty, about, national projection, as opposed to Australia. I know the Philippines is probably our closest, neighbor as far as alignment to the US is concerned. But look, it is just so good to have you here. I think this is one of the great episodes we've done. Really unpacking.
That's very kind of you to say so.
Really
provide more positive.
Look, it's really good to sort of get into that, and not so much from a chronological standpoint, which I think a lot of people are starting to come to terms with regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict in particular, but also just looking at all those kind of Easter eggs and those little hidden bits and pieces in there that really, once you put a bit of light on them, they really help to sort of weave together that connective tissue and give you a bit more of a totality about, just how complex and nuanced this actual whole thing is. So thank you.
My pleasure, actually. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, yeah, hopefully we can get you on again soon to talk about some of your papers, including your work on dissidents. And, I might be one here one day, so I'm just doing it for my own personal value. So thank you.
Well, maybe true of both of us if we're not careful.
Cheers,
Okay,
Professor. Take care.
bye for now.